They told me, "Mom, this isn't your home anymore. It's hers." That was the sentence. The blade disguised as explanation. The last words I heard before the door clicked shut behind me, and I found myself standing in the fading light of evening with a suitcase that was not even fully zipped. A plastic grocery bag with my medicines and a coat I had grabbed without thinking. I had not expected gratitude, not really, but I had never expected to be exiled like that, as if I were an intruder in the very house I had once kept afloat with my savings, my casseroles, my babysitting, my endless, invisible hours of service. I am 74 years old, and now I live alone in a cramped apartment on the edge of town, where the walls are thin enough that I can hear the upstairs neighbor's television and the radiators complain like old bones every time the heat stirs to life. It is not much, this place, but it is mine. And that, after so many years of being an accessory in someone else's picture, feels like more than I ever thought I would have again. I replay that night often because it was not just rejection, it was erasure. And what makes it sting worse is how ordinary it was for them, how procedural, how sanitized. There was no fight, no shouting, no melodrama, only the polite cruelty of people who had rehearsed what they would say, so it would sound inevitable rather than brutal. My son avoided my eyes, shifting from foot to foot like a boy rehearsing lines for a play he did not believe in, while his wife stood half a step behind him, her arms folded loosely, her mouth pressed into a smile that was neither warm nor cold, but something much worse, practiced, managerial, efficient. "We just need the space," she said, as if I were a piece of furniture taking up too much room. And then, with a tilt of her chin, she added, "It'll be better for everyone." Better for everyone, meaning better for her, for the picture she wanted to paint of a life without the intrusion of an old woman's habits, her tea bags on the counter, her slippers by the sofa, her laughter when the baby learned to clap. My son nodded, and I saw the way his shoulders sagged, not with shame, but with relief that she had spoken the words he could not muster, and then he placed my bag by the door. That was all. I remember how the air outside felt, a chill that clung to my skin and made me shiver even though the evening was not yet truly cold. I remember how the sky looked bruised, the last streaks of pink dissolving into gray, and I remember the sound of the door clicking shut behind me, a sound too final for what was supposed to be family. I remember standing there for longer than I should have, waiting for the door to open again, waiting for my son to step outside and say it had been a mistake, that they were tired, that they were stressed, that of course his mother was still welcome in her own home. But the door stayed closed. Behind it, I could hear laughter, the sharp, rehearsed kind of laughter people use to stitch over silence. They had already moved on to dinner. I carried my suitcase to the curb and sat down on it like a traveler stranded between stations. And for a long moment, I thought about calling a cab. But my hands shook too much to hold the phone steady. And besides, who does one call when one has just been made a stranger in the house that once smelled of one's own cooking? You might think I cried then. I did not. The tears had been trained out of me long ago, in all those years when exhaustion had to be swallowed quietly, because there were lunches to pack, laundry to fold, bills to pay, lessons to drive to, arguments to diffuse. I learned how to hold my face still while my insides crumbled, and that night was no different. Instead of crying, I studied the streetlights flickering to life, and I studied the neighbor across the road trimming his roses as if nothing unusual was happening on the other side. as if he did not notice an old woman perched on a suitcase like unwanted luggage. Maybe he did notice and chose to look away, because that is what people do with the elderly, with the inconvenient, with anyone whose presence does not fit the narrative of domestic bliss. They turn their eyes toward safer ground. I sat there until my legs began to ache and my back stiffened from the angle. And then I stood, pulled my suitcase behind me, and began walking, though I did not yet know where I was going. Each step felt like an argument with gravity, as if the earth itself wanted to pin me down and remind me of my age, of my uselessness. But another part of me, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be necessary, kept moving. I walked past the house I had once scrubbed on my knees when Daniel, my son, was a boy, and tracked mud across the carpet. I walked past the tree under which I had stood during his first driving lesson, my heart hammering as he pressed the gas too quickly. I walked past the driveway where I had once handed him the lunchbox he had forgotten, running barefoot to catch him before the school bus left. All of it, every corner of that block, held me in its memory, yet none of it was mine anymore. Do you know what betrayal feels like at 74? It does not feel like rage, not immediately. Rage is too sharp, too young a sensation. It feels instead like silence pressing on your chest, like a hand you cannot push away. It feels like the body remembers every sacrifice you made, every late night, every double shift, every holiday meal saved from ruin, and mocks you with the knowledge that none of it secured a place for you at the table. People imagine betrayal is loud. For me, it was quiet. It was a door clicking shut, a neighbor pruning roses, a child who did not look back. Now, in this small apartment where the wallpaper curls at the corners and the kitchen window looks out over an alley where cats prowl at night, I replay the words again and again. Mom, this isn't your home anymore. It's hers. My son's voice was steady, almost apologetic, but there was no tremor of doubt. He believed it. Or at least he wanted to believe it badly enough that he could stand there and watch me pack. I imagine him lying awake afterward, convincing himself it had been the right thing, that it had been necessary, that his wife was right to want her own space. Perhaps he even told himself I was strong enough to manage on my own. Perhaps he forgot strength wears thin, like fabric rubbed too many times against a sharp edge. The truth is that I am strong, but strength is not the same as being unbreakable. Strength bends. Strength limps. Strength sits on a suitcase under a bruised sky and waits for a door that never opens again. And yet, even then, even in that moment, a small, fierce part of me whispered something I had not heard in years. You are still here. You are not finished. That whisper has been the only companion in this room when the nights stretch long and the past presses too close. That whisper keeps me steady now as I tell you this story, because it deserves to be told, not as a tragedy, not as a plea for pity, but as a record, as a warning, as a reminder that a mother is not a temporary guest in her child's life, and when she is treated as one, something irreversible happens. Something closes, not just a door, but a bond, and once it closes, there is no unlocking it. I am 74 years old, and I live alone. That is the truth. But the deeper truth is that I carry every version of myself into this little apartment. The young woman who worked 2 jobs to pay tuition for the boy who would one day call me a burden. The mother who stayed awake by the hospital bed when fever rattled his body. The widow who held on longer than she should have to a house that was never really hers. All of them live here with me, crowded into these thin walls, all of them bearing witness. And when I sit at the small table with my chipped mug of tea and the radiator groans behind me, I think, perhaps this is not the ending. Perhaps this is the beginning, the part where the woman who was told she no longer belongs discovers that belonging was never something another person had the right to grant. The defining moment, the one I return to again and again when I lie awake at night, did not arrive like thunder or some dramatic collapse. It came with the quiet efficiency of paperwork being shuffled and a conversation rehearsed too many times. My son did not yell, did not even look angry. He looked like a man performing an unpleasant duty, like a landlord informing a tenant that the lease would not be renewed. It happened on a Tuesday evening after dinner when the baby had been put to bed and the dishwasher was humming in the background. I had cleared the plates, rinsed them, and was standing at the sink with my hands in the warm water when I felt the shift in the room, the silence that was not silence at all but a prelude, the heavy pause before words you know will sting. He came and stood behind me, his reflection half caught in the window above the sink, and his wife sat at the table with her glass of wine, her phone placed neatly beside it, as if she were documenting every detail in her head. He said, "Mom, can we talk?" But the tone was already decided, the outcome already written. I dried my hands slowly on the towel because I wanted to delay the moment, but also because I wanted dignity. And then I turned. He did not invite me to sit. He simply kept standing, shifting from one foot to the other. "It's about the house," he said, and my heart sank, because I knew the house was the battlefield where every hidden tension had always lived. It was the house I had put money into, the house where I had painted walls and planted tulips, the house I had thought would be the place where I might grow old with family close by. He cleared his throat, his wife's eyes fixed on him like a teacher watching a nervous student recite. "Carla and I have been talking," he continued, and I almost laughed, because when he says Carla and I, it always means Carla has decided and he has agreed. He said, "We need more privacy, more room to build our life as a family, and, well, Mom, it's just not working with you here anymore." There it was, so soft, so deceptively polite, like a knife slid between the ribs with the handle wrapped in silk. I remember asking, though my voice sounded like it came from somewhere else, "Not working? What exactly isn't working?" And before my son could answer, she leaned forward with that practiced calm she wears in social settings and said, "You've been wonderful helping us truly, but we need boundaries. You've had your time raising children, now it's our time. The baby needs a routine without extra influences, and honestly, we just need space." She said it as if she were discussing furniture arrangement, not uprooting the woman who had rocked that baby to sleep when she was too tired, not dismissing the person who had poured herself into the mortar of that family for decades. I looked at my son then, searching his face for a crack, a sign that this was not his conviction, but hers alone, that he might step in and soften the blow. But he would not meet my eyes. He said only, "It'll be better for everyone." And with that, he was done. My knees trembled, and I gripped the back of a chair because I thought for a moment I might sit down hard on the floor, not from shock, but from the sudden emptiness that hollowed me out. I wanted to scream, to remind him of the hospital bills I paid when he had pneumonia at 7, of the time I walked to work in the snow so he would have the car to get to school, of the years I skipped vacations new clothes, even proper meals so he could have shoes that fit and books that weren't secondhand. But none of that fit into the script they had written. In their story, I was no longer mother, no longer anchor, no longer sacrifice. I was simply a body taking up space, a voice they preferred not to hear. He gave me 1 week to pack. A week? After 40 years of holding him up, of being the scaffolding under his life, I was given 7 days to erase myself from his household. He suggested it like a favor, like he was being generous. "We don't want you rushing, Mom," he said, and she added, "Of course, we'll help you find somewhere suitable." Suitable. As if I were an old dog in need of a kennel. As if I could be moved around like an inconvenient chair. That word lodged itself deep, and I felt my spine stiffen even as my hands shook. I nodded, because what else could I do? But inside, something began to crack. Not the soft crack of sorrow, but the sharp one of awakening. In the days that followed, I moved quietly around the house like a ghost, touching objects that had once been mine, but now looked like strangers. The teapot I had used every morning, the picture frames where my face had been replaced by curated prints, the blankets I had crocheted folded away in a closet so no visitor would see them. I packed what I could fit into 2 suitcases and a few boxes, leaving behind the heavy furniture, the dishes, the curtains I had chosen. Every item I folded into the suitcase felt like a question. Was I really no longer needed? Was I truly so disposable? And every time I asked myself, the silence of the house answered yes. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. They thought I was upstairs, but I stood in the hallway where the vent carried every word. She said, "I don't want her influencing how we raise our child. She's too old-fashioned. It's better this way." And he said, "I know, it feels wrong, but it has to be done." She replied, "She'll manage. Old people always do, old people. Not mother, not grandmother, just old people, lumped into a faceless category, dismissed as stubborn survivors who could be pushed aside without guilt." My hands gripped the railing so tightly I left dents in the soft wood. And in that moment, the betrayal crystallized. This was not about space, not about privacy. It was about erasing me so they could live in a world where I did not exist. The last night before I left, I sat in the room that had been mine, staring at the pale walls and the packed bags, and I thought about all the ways a person can disappear without dying. You can be written out of photographs. You can be erased from holiday traditions. You can be struck from the list of people whose opinion matters. That is what they were doing, slowly, methodically, as if I were a stain being scrubbed from the fabric. When morning came, I did not wait for them to wake. I wheeled my suitcase down the hall, opened the front door quietly, and stepped out before the baby stirred, before my son might have had the chance to look at me and remember, even briefly, who I had been to him. That was the moment of betrayal, not the packing, not the moving, but the silence of the door closing behind me, the knowledge that no one would come running after me, no one would call out, no one would stop me. They had chosen their life, and in that life I was not a chapter. I was a footnote erased before publication. That was the catalyst, the wound that does not bleed but burns, the cut that does not heal but scars, the moment I stopped being mother and became exile. The week after I left their house unfolded, not like a series of events, but like a long corridor where every door I tried was locked and every light switch clicked to nothing. And in that dimness, I could hear the echo of my own footsteps, the sound of a woman who had been useful for decades and now was simply additional noise that people preferred not to hear. I took a room at a roadside motel first because there are decisions you make out of pride, and there are decisions you make when your hands are shaking and you cannot picture the sunrise from anywhere but the nearest vacancy sign. And the woman at the desk did not ask questions beyond a credit card and an ID. And when she slid a key across the counter, it felt like someone saying, "Here, hold this until we decide if you exist." The room smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke. The bedspread's pattern tried to be cheerful and failed by several years. The bathroom mirror sliced my face into angles that did not belong to me, and still I put my bag down and hung my coat over the back of the one chair and lined up my medications on the dresser, as if routine could anchor me to a shore that had eroded overnight. I ate dinner from a vending machine that spat out a packet of crackers with a hollow clatter, and I sat on the edge of the bed feeling both foolish and oddly steady, because at least the silence belonged to me, not to a house where my footsteps were, an offense and my advice an intrusion. And when the heater started its relentless rattle, I told myself that a rattle was better than a closed door. In the morning, I tried to be efficient, because efficiency is the armor of the discarded. I made a list on motel stationery with a blue pen that skipped on every third letter, and I wrote, "Call the bank. Call the clinic about my blood pressure. Prescription. Look at rentals near the bus line. Find the box with the photographs I thought I had taken, and remember whether I even packed it." Because grief disorganizes not just your heart, but your memory. And I could not tell if I had left behind the faces that knew me or if they had been removed from me long before the week of packing. At the bank, the young teller spoke slowly and too brightly, the way people speak to small children or to the elderly when they think patience is a favor. And she asked me 3 times to confirm my mailing address. And on the third time, my voice shook. And I said, "It changed. I'm changing it." And she blinked and typed and told me to have a blessed day without looking up. I sat on a bench outside the branch and watched a mother drag a reluctant toddler toward a minivan and wondered when I had become the woman other women did not see because they were too busy being necessary. And it occurred to me with a kind of startled clarity that necessity is a currency that expires when the people you serve decide the price is too high. I went to see an efficiency apartment a few miles from the motel because the listing said ground floor and the rent was barely within reach, and the landlord wore a baseball cap that announced a team I do not follow and a breath that announced onions. And he walked me through the place with the pride of a man showing off a new ship, pointing at the stove as if it were a marvel and rapping his knuckles on the window as if it were proof against storms. And he recited the rules in a monotone that had smoothed the edges off any empathy he might once have had. No guests past 9, no holes in the walls, no pets, rent due on the 1st, late fee on the 2nd, eviction filed on the 4th. The room itself was a geometry of compromise, a rectangle with a kitchenette along one side and a window that faced an alley where a dumpster listed like a tired animal, and there was a faint scratch in the floor where someone's chair had rocked through their last months there. And I thought, I can live here, because I have lived in worse places for better reasons, and in better places for worse love. And when he asked if I had family who would co-sign, I said no. My family prefers privacy. And he did not catch the wire in my voice. He simply slid the application across and tapped the line for emergency contact. And I stared at that space until the letters blurred because I did not know whose number to write anymore. The days stretched without markers, and the things that used to tether me, grocery lists thick with other people's preferences, reminders to call the pediatrician, the weekly habit of polishing the dining table for a family that believed shine was proof of goodness, fell away. And in their absence, I felt a kind of nausea, the vertigo of a person who has stepped off a staircase, believing there was one more riser and found only air. I walked to the discount store for a set of plates and a saucepan, because the motel microwave turned soup into something resentful. And the clerk bagged my purchases with the distracted kindness of someone who has learned that people cry in housewares aisles, and it is best not to ask why. And on my way back to the motel, an old church bell rang the hour, and I found myself counting the strikes like a child, as if numbers could settle me. I tried calling my son once that week, not because I wanted to ask to return. That door had closed with a click I still heard in my sleep, but because I wanted to tell him I had found a place to stay and I would be fine, the way a mother tells a child. She has arrived safely, though the road was longer than expected. The call went to voicemail, his greeting brisk and businesslike, and I left a message measured to the syllable, careful not to sound accusatory or needy. And when no reply came, I found an unexpected calm blooming where panic should have been. A small proof that one can survive being unacknowledged and still not vanish. At night, the motel walls carried the lives of strangers like thin cloth carries light, and I learned the rhythms of the couple next door without wanting to. Their arguments that rose and fell like a wind that cannot find its direction, the thud of a suitcase at odd hours, the cough that lingered after the shower went off. I lay awake and tried to decide if it was worse to be unseen or overheard. And I think I chose overheard, because at least it proved I was still in the world with others, not exiled to a museum of my own quiet. I realized, too, how the small humiliations multiplied when no one said your name at the end of the day. A bus driver impatient with my slow climb up the steps, a pharmacist who could not find my profile because my address had changed, and with it, my place in her regard, a neighbor in the hallway who set down his grocery bags to unlock his door and never once looked in my direction. Perhaps because if he had, he would have had to think about his own mother, his own future, his own corridor of locked doors. I found the box with the photographs on the third try, opening and resealing cartons until my hands were gray with cardboard dust. And when I lifted the lid, the faces rose like a tide. My boy with a missing front tooth holding a homemade kite. My boy. In an ill-fitting suit for a school concert, my boy asleep on a sofa under a blanket I had crocheted, and I had to sit down on the floor because the past is heavy, even when it is made of paper. And I thought, how did we get from there to a woman at a desk handing me a key that smells of bleach? I did not cry, because tears felt like a request for someone to notice, and there was no one I was willing to beg for attention anymore. So I slid the photographs back into their envelope and tucked them in the bottom of the suitcase beneath my shoes, not because I was hiding them, but because I was not yet strong enough to hang them in a place that might require me to explain to a landlord why I needed a nail. It occurred to me somewhere during that week that absence is not neutral. It is an active thing. It grows. It fills space left by the person who was removed. It rearranges furniture even when no one moves a chair. and I could feel the absence of me in their house like a draft that would not quit. I imagined them at the table without my clatter in the kitchen. Imagined the baby fussing and no one humming the old lullaby because my version had been labeled interference. Imagined the dishwasher failing to latch and my son staring at it with the same helpless look he had at 12 when his shoelaces knotted beyond his patience and I knelt to untangle them. And I wondered if he felt a tremor, a thin shock of missing something he could not name. I do not wish him harm. I wish him accuracy, the clear sight of a man who understands the cost of his comforts, because the first escalation was not my move to the motel or the application for the apartment. It was the slow, accurate seeing of how I had been erased while I still stood in the room, the confirmation that the erasure continued efficiently in my absence, as if I had been a stain successfully lifted from a good rug. By the time the week ended, I had the keys to the efficiency and the landlord's packet of rules folded in my purse like a thin catechism, and I carried my 2 suitcases up the shallow steps by myself because there was no one to ask, and more importantly, because asking would have been a ritual of the old life, the one where I apologized for taking up time, and I was tired of being sorry. I set the suitcases in the center of the room and stood there breathing the strange air of a space that did not know me yet. And for a long moment, I felt the ache of everything I had lost as one pain. Not the sharp kind that reduces you to noise, but the deep one that insists you learn its language. In that ache, there was a dangerous temptation to call, to plead, to say I was tired and cold, and could I please come back just for a few days until I felt steady? And I thought of the door closing, and I thought of the neighbor pruning roses, and I thought of the word suitable said in a voice that had never once asked me what I wanted. And I realized that even a thin mattress in a room with a view of a dumpster was preferable to a guest room in a home where my presence was a problem to be. Solved. I boiled water in the new saucepan for tea that tasted of metal and resilience, and I drank it standing up. And then I began to put things away, not because I was content or certain or healed, but because life, even in exile, wants a drawer for socks, and a hook for a coat, and a place where a woman can set a cup down without asking permission. The shift did not arrive as triumph or even relief. It arrived like the small light on a stove finally catching after a dozen weak clicks, a quiet blue ring of flame steadying itself in air that had forgotten warmth, and the first way I knew I was. Done being the woman who waited to be invited into her own life was the morning I woke up in the efficiency to the throb of the dumpster truck, sat on the edge of the bed with my hand on the sour metal of the kettle, and said out loud, as if to a stubborn appliance, "We will not beg." After that, I moved through the day differently, not quickly, never that, but with a practical, deliberate care that felt almost like reverence, because each small choice was mine, and after a lifetime of being the person who arranged other people's choices into tidy, invisible comfort, the novelty of choosing for myself was both dizzying and medicinal. I took the bus downtown and walked past the shops that smelled of new plastic and the ones that smelled of dust, and I stopped where the windows held other people's cast-offs. A thrift store with a bell that didn't ring when I pushed the door because someone had taped it open with blue painter's tape, and tables crowded with mismatched plates and a row of old lamps whose shades leaned like tired heads, and I stood very still before a battered wooden chair with a high back and a scar, where someone had once dropped a pan, and it struck me with the certainty reserved for grief and weather that this was my chair, because it looked like something that had done work and was still here. I bought it for $8, and the boy who carried it to the curb for me said I reminded him of his grandmother, and I nearly told him to call her, not because it would help me, but because people imagine time is a hallway. You can turn around in whenever you like, and it isn't. I dragged the chair home one bus stop at a time, setting it down on the sidewalk between stops, like a pilgrim sets down a stone. And when I finally wrestled it through the door, I placed it under the window and sat until my heart stopped scolding me. From that height, the alley almost looked like a courtyard, and the dented lid of the dumpster caught a patch of pale sky and threw it back to me like a stubborn promise. That afternoon, I wrote my name on a piece of masking tape and stuck it on the inside of the cabinet above the sink, not for anyone else to see, but so that when I reached for a cup, I could feel the small weight of belonging. And then I took the crumpled flyer I had kept from the motel lobby. Help wanted, morning counter, bakery. No experience necessary, must show up. And I walked 3 blocks to a storefront that smelled like butter and Monday, where a woman with a hairnet and the posture of someone who has never once been surprised asked me if I could be there at 5:30 and not make a fuss about the espresso machine. I told her I had been elbow deep in fuss for 50 years and survived it with grace. She blinked, nodded, and handed me an apron that had been washed to the color of tired rain. The first shift was a lesson in humility and muscle memory, because kindness is a choreography the hands remember before the brain approves. And as I folded pastry boxes and learned the register's stubborn beeps, I discovered that my voice could be warm without apology and firm without bitterness. And when a young man in a shirt too tight across his shoulders snapped that I had counted wrong, I simply pushed the coins back toward him with a steady finger and said, "Count again, darling, and watch what happens when you breathe." He did, and he blushed, and I did not take the blushing as victory, only as proof that I had not become a wall. The baker, whose name was Pilar, slid me a heel of bread bruised with blackberry and said the rule was that mistakes were for staff. And I thought how I had been punished for decades for mistakes I had not made, and here was a rule that reimagined error as nourishment, and I took a bite that stained my fingers purple and nearly laughed with the shock of it. By the second morning, my feet had remembered how to complain without mutiny, and my mind had remembered how to count change while listening for the sound of the oven timer under the clang of the bell, and a retired school bus driver who ordered 2. Plain rolls and a small coffee began leaving his newspaper on the counter for me with the crossword still blank, and he would say, "I like to start my day believing someone can finish a thing." And I would answer, "I used to start my day believing the same." And I felt the exchange settle between us like a small bridge no one else needed to cross. At home, the efficiency began to yield a shape, not pretty and not pitiable, simply used, and there is honor in used. I scrubbed the bathroom with baking soda until the grout surrendered its film. I folded my 2 sets of sheets and chose the less worn for the bed because respect begins in the minutes no one sees. I bought a narrow rug from the same thrift store, faded blue with a threadbare stripe like a river in late summer, and I cut fresh lemons into a jar so the room would smell less of old decisions and more of something that could still be corrected. I set the chair where the window caught an hour of winter sun, and I put my husband's old pocket knife in the drawer beside the bed, not for defense, but for memory. And then I did a thing I had been avoiding. I sat with a notebook, the cheap spiral, kind with a cover that pretends to be firm, and I wrote down the rules I would keep now that no one else's comfort would be the measure of my worth. And they were not dramatic rules, not the sort that can be framed over a kitchen table and admired by guests. They were plain as shoes at the door. No apologies for existing, no rooms where I am a ghost, no money I cannot see, no advice that is not asked for twice, no return to any house where my presence requires camouflage. And when I finished the list, I did not sign it with anger. I signed it with my name as if I were witnessing a document that finally told the truth. The next payday happened faster than the month deserved. A small envelope that would have shamed me once with its thinness, but now felt like a certificate. I cashed it in 5s and 1s because there is a dignity in small bills when you line them in, ajar, and see them gather like rain. And on the way home, I stepped into a consignment shop where a coat hung with the seriousness of something that had been stitched by hands that trusted winter to behave. Navy wool with deep pockets and a missing button that allowed me to speak to it kindly. And when I tried it on, I recognized the version of myself who had once walked decisively through a station with a child's hand in hers. And I bought it without asking a mirror to vote. The first time I wore it to work, Pilar looked at me as if I had told a joke with a proper punchline and said, "Be careful. That coat will make you say what you mean." And I answered, "Good, because I am late to that particular party." And she laughed in the quiet way people laugh when they recognize a fellow survivor. There were other small salvations disguised as errands. The library card I requested, with a voice that did not tremble, and the librarian's stamp that thudded like permission. The inexpensive lamp I found on a curb and carried home. Shade cracked, base steady, and the way its circle of light turned the chair into a harbor where I could read at night without the ache that used to arrive when the house quieted, and the memory of being unwelcome shouted louder than any radio. There was the neighbor. 2 doors down. A woman with gray hair in a braid and a cane. She used the way a conductor uses a baton, who stopped me on the stairs to ask if I liked stewed apples and did not pretend it was a casual question. And when I said yes, she handed me a jar, still warm, and told me her name was Alma. And later, when I washed the jar and returned it with a lemon tucked inside, she said, "That's how alliances are forged, dear. Citrus and glass and the courage not to apologize for knocking." There was even, because life can be generous when you stop begging it to be pretty, a morning when a boy in a backpack held the bakery door for me and called me ma'am without flinching. And I thought about my son's careful avoidance of the words that would have named me in his world, and I let the contrast sit like a stone in water, solid and cooling. The midpoint, if that's what this was, did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived in the grit under my fingernails after I planted a pot of parsley on the sill and remembered how earth smells like certainty. In the moment at the bus stop when I did not rehearse what I would say if my son called because I was busy reading the poem taped inside the shelter by a hand that had wanted strangers to have one good line before work, in the new habit of leaving my phone face down and not touching it. After supper, because hunger that does not ask for me does not get fed. And in the way my mouth shaped the word no once or twice a week and did not splinter. If there was a single emblem, it was the spare key I had cut at the hardware store, where the clerk called everyone boss without irony and handed me a small tag shaped like a house. And I stood beneath the fluorescent lights and wrote my own name on it. Not a title, not a role, just the letters that refused to disappear. And for an instant, the world aligned like a well-hung door on good hinges. This is my place. This is my work. This is my name. This is my life. Reprised not as second act, but as first, because the first one, I see now, was performed on a stage I built with my own hands and never stood center on. I went home and boiled potatoes and mashed them with butter and salt and ate from the pot leaning against the counter, and I did not feel sorry for myself or noble. I felt fed, and fed is a kind of truth the body remembers when the heart is tired of repeating its lessons. Later, in the chair with the lamp casting its circle, I opened the notebook and wrote one more rule that made the pen hesitate, because it is hard to give yourself what no one ever handed you. I will not return to any version of love that requires me to vanish. When I set the pen down, my hand shook and then stilled. And in that stillness, I understood that the point was not to be invulnerable. It was to be visible to myself at last, even if no one else was looking. It began the way pressure always begins, not with shouting or a single dramatic blow, but with a sequence of small adjustments in the air. A subtle tightening you only notice because your breath has started to shorten. And the first sign was the envelope slid under Joyce's door in the hour when the mail had already been delivered and the sun had already given up trying to warm the porch boards. A pale, legal mouth that did not bother to knock, and inside was a letter written in a tone that pretended to be careful, but left fingerprints of condescension on every line. A neat insistence that I confirm my safety, my competence, my whereabouts, my assets, as if a mother were a minor needing permission to cross a street, as if the act of choosing an address not curated by my son and his wife were evidence of confusion rather than preference. I read the first page and felt the old machinery of my obedience reach for its switch, the reflex to comply, to soothe, to produce documents and proofs and explanations, and then the new machinery, the one I had been oiling with small acts, chairs dragged home, coats bought with cash, morning shifts finished with the register balanced to the penny, caught and held. And I put the letter down, made tea, and let the kettle's thin scream die before I answered anything at all. The second sign was quieter and meaner. My bank card declined for a loaf of bread at the corner market because the address on file no longer matched, and the security protocols decided that change belonged to thieves. And I stood there holding the bag like a shoplifter who had paid with coin instead of apology until the clerk said, "Take it. Pay me tomorrow. I've seen worse." And when I called the bank from the sidewalk, they asked to speak to the person who usually handled my accounts, and I told them that person had been retired for cause, and the woman on the other end laughed without humor and put me on hold long enough to measure how badly I wanted to remain solvent. When she returned, I gave her my new address, syllable by syllable, wrote down the confirmation number, and thanked her with the steady voice of a woman who knows that gratitude is sometimes camouflage. Around the same time, the newspaper arrived, not to me first, but to the cafe, because a customer, keen on small-town dramas that let him ignore large national ones, had left it open to the community section and circled my face with a pen like a teacher grading an exam, and Heather, protective in the way pragmatic women grow protective when they find something worth keeping, flipped the page with 2 fingers and said nothing, but her silence had weight and heat, and I felt strangely seen by how she did not add to the humiliation by narrating it. I read the headline that called me vulnerable with the same taste in my mouth I used to get after biting into fruit that had been waxed to look sweeter than it was, and while the words pretended to be a prayer for my safe return, they were a test balloon floated to see who would report my location. A net woven with concern meant to gather me back to the aquarium where old fish are admired for their glint and ignored for their hunger. Arthur read it too, and because he had learned in his long marriage that gentleness is also accuracy, he slid across the table a paper bag with a magnet inside, shaped like a birdhouse, and said nothing except, "I saw this and thought of you." And the restraint of that gift steadied me better than any argument would have, because it agreed silently with my new rule that love which needs to be announced has already put on its coat. The next day, the man in the suit appeared, his tie the color of pavement after rain, and he waited until my shift ended to perform his lines, the ones that said my name as if it were a case file and asked about my well-being as if he were measuring my temperature with a stick, and when I told him I was fine, he lowered his voice, as if intimacy were a matter of decibels, and suggested guardianship, joint accounts, supervised visits with grandchildren who were already supervised by their own. Boredom. And when I did not flinch, he brightened in a way that made my stomach go cold, and mentioned, in a tone of feigned regret, how terribly easy it is for older women to be scammed by new friends, by landlords, by charming cafe patrons, with steady hands and interesting stories about birds. He glanced toward Arthur's booth then, and I watched something hot and uncharitable flare in my chest. Not for me, but for the way men like that think threats are more effective when they borrow the outline of your joys. I told him, in a voice that carried to the kitchen, that my assets had learned to sleep with one eye open long before my son discovered scented candles, that my mind remained a room I could still lock from the inside, and that any further contact should arrive through my mailbox wearing a stamp and the full name of his firm. He began to say, "We're only trying to help," and I interrupted him with, "We have very different definitions of help," and I took off my apron and left him blinking in the doorway as if he had stepped from shade into noon. And when I rounded the corner of the block, I realized my hands were shaking and my jaw ached from the clench I had not felt since the night my husband died, and the doctor spoke to my son, because he believed fatherhood outranks widowhood in medical hierarchies. That week, I received a welfare check at Joyce's, a soft knock at 9 p.m., and the squared shoulders of 2 officers who had been told there was an elderly woman at risk, and in the hallway that smelled of onions and lavender. I showed them my pantry with its stubborn rows of beans and tea, my license with its stubborn date of birth, my pay stubs with their stubborn sums, and they nodded at all the proof that I existed according to systems they understood, and one of them asked if I felt safe, and I said, with the lightest smile I could manage, "Safer than women who are adored in public and erased in private," and he looked at the floor and wished me a good night. After they left, Joyce sat at the table and lit a cigarette she pretended to have given up years ago, the smoke rising in the kitchen like an old hymn, and she said, "Well, they're escalating." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you need me to lie for you going forward?" And I said, "No, not lies. Just refuse the dignity of answering questions they have not earned the right to ask. She nodded like a general who approves of a strategy that costs fewer lives, and we ate the last of the sweet potato cake, cold, with forks from the pan, and Franklin the cat paced the counter like an old man remembering rooms he once owned. The past did not come only through official channels. It came with Liza's perfume before it came with her body, that expensive, clean scent designed to make a person smell like they have never sweat in a kitchen. And when she finally walked into the cafe, her eyes were the color of expensive glass, hard and clear and easily shattered. And she asked for privacy without looking around to see the regulars watching, with the discreet interest of people who understand that whatever happens next will be repeated with more compassion than it deserves. We sat in the back booth, and I let her deliver her tactics in the order she had rehearsed them. The appeal to family harmony, the appeal to grandchildren who supposedly asked for me by name, though she had trained them to use grandma like a brand on a mug. The appeal to my own supposed need for stability, the threat of paperwork, the pretense of apology shrinking as she discovered it earned her nothing, and finally, the confession she did not mean as confession, but as plea, that she had feared my shadow in every room because it reminded her that nothing she was building had roots that predated her entrance. And I was surprised by the sudden clearness of my patience. How I could listen without volunteering to fold myself smaller. How I could hear the difference between being needed and being used. And when she placed an envelope on the Formica, I took it, not because I wanted anything inside, but because I needed to show myself I was not frightened of her offerings. Later, it held only a photo and a note from Kieran, the one person in that house who wrote sentences that did not try to move furniture in my mind. And I stood in my room with the photo between my fingers and felt not grief exactly, but the ache of muscles waking after a long anesthesia, painful and correct. The pressure did not relent. There were calls from unknown numbers that hung up the moment I answered, and a rumor that I was unwell began to circulate through the cafe like a draft whenever a door opened. And Heather met each whisper with the damp, heavy towel of her sarcasm, smothering it without spectacle. And Arthur took to walking me 2 blocks toward home, on afternoons when the light failed early, and he spoke about weather fronts and the habits of juncos, and a recipe his late wife had for potato soup that could rescue a day, and I let the harmless sound of care pattern the air around me like netting that keeps falling branches from breaking windows. I made mistakes, too, small ones that felt large. I turned my phone on one night when the house was too quiet and listened to messages layered like sediment, my son's voice tightening through the geologic time of voicemail, first with irritation, then with wounded authority, then with a brittle despair that ended in the kind of threat people think is reason, but is only fear. And I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the old tug of motherhood, that reflexive reach to fix what is collapsing in your child even when he is the one who loosened the screws, and I did not call back, because help given into the wrong mouth becomes a weapon, and I had written that rule by hand. Then, as if the second escalation needed a scene to mark its apex in my body, he arrived himself, not at the cafe where witnesses might compensate for shame, but in the alley behind my building, where the afternoon light sits, as if it has decided to stay low for the rest of the week, and I knew it was him not by the knock, which was tentative and too polite for a son who once called before coming over to ask if there would be casserole, but by the pattern of his breathing, a shallow, practiced control. The kind a man learns when he is telling a story on the phone he cannot afford to tell with tears. I opened the back door and found him standing with his hands jammed in his jacket, as if to warm them on his own impatience, eyes red, not from crying, but from not sleeping, stubble grown in because pride requires maintenance, and he had run short of it. And behind him, parked at an awkward angle, was his car. Seat reclined, passenger window cracked. A fleece blanket folded in the shape of a fly. He did not hug me or ask to come in, perhaps because the doorframe looked narrower than he remembered, or because the smell of onions and soap drifting from the kitchen was too reminiscent of childhood safety to bear. Instead, he said, in the voice he reserves for bad news, he wants to turn into a favor requested, that the house had become difficult, that the market had punished him, that a misunderstanding at work had required a cooling-off period without pay, that I must have seen the article and understood how worried they were, that Lisa had overreacted to some things he had said, that the in-laws who loved brunch were not as eager to love men who faltered, that this was temporary. And while he did not say the words, "I'm sleeping in the car," he gestured toward it with the embarrassed flick of a wrist men use when they discover the world still refuses to be managed by email. And I felt what a mother feels when her child shows up half-drowned. The pure animal rushed to drag him to shore, to wrap him, to feed him, to say it will be all right and mean it with the blind certainty that has saved more lives than medicine. I stood there with the door against my shoulder blade like a hand, and I inhaled very slowly and counted to 5 because counting had become my method of choosing the future I could live with. And on the inward spiral of the breath, I saw 2 movies, one in which I opened the door and let him in, and watched the furniture of my hard-won self rearrange itself to accommodate an old script that never wrote me as a person with terms, and another in which I stepped out with a blanket, with food, with the names of shelters and the location of a mechanic who took payment plans and a lawyer who owed Joyce a favor. And in that second film, I heard my voice, not breaking, not triumphant, simply adult, and I chose it. He saw me choose, and something flickered in his eyes, maybe fear, maybe respect, maybe the grief of recognizing the mother you knew has learned to be more than a mother. And he said, "Please, just for a night." And there it was, the test written cleanly, in the margin of everything I had rebuilt. And before I answered, I thought of Kieran's quiet letters, of Arthur's birdhouse magnet, of Heather's steady hands, of Joyce's cigarettes and sarcasm, of the coat with deep pockets that had taught my spine to stand in any weather, and of the rule I had written about not returning to love that required me to disappear. And I said, "We will talk, but not inside." I said, "I will bring you a thermos and a sandwich, and the address of a place that will not shame you for arriving in daylight." I said, "I will call you tomorrow at noon, and if you pick up, we will make a plan. But I will not return to a world where my kindness is a currency devalued at whim." He stared at me like I had spoken another language, and perhaps I had, because the dialect of boundaries is not one he was raised to decipher, and he opened his mouth and closed it, and finally nodded, and I closed the door gently enough that the air did not shudder, went to the kitchen, packed what I would have packed for any stranger in trouble: soup, bread, an orange, a note with 3 phone numbers, and the sentence, "You are not alone if you do not insist on being." And when I returned to the alley, he took the bag without meeting my eyes and said thank you, in a voice that made me think of him at 8, feverish and furious at being small. And then he got into the car and turned his face away in the dark shine of the window. That night, I did not sleep much. The pipe sighed. The cat muttered to his dreams. Joy snored with the integrity of someone who has earned the right to breathe however she pleases, and I lay awake, measuring the distance between mercy and surrender, checking the locks on the new doors in me, finding them intact. And when morning pushed itself between the blinds, I felt worn but unbroken. And that is the only victory I recognize now. The second escalation did not end with his visit. There were follow-up messages from numbers that wanted to pull me into debates about duty dressed up as love. There was a postcard from a cousin I had not heard from in years asking if I had considered how this looks. And there was, oddly, a small bouquet left on the cafe counter without a card. Mismatched stems of grocery store flowers that looked like a child had picked them, and I tucked them into a jar and set them beside the two register, because beauty, even clumsy beauty, belongs to the ones who keep showing up. When noon came, I called the number he had answered from the night before, and when he picked up, his voice sounded older, the false bravado drained by a shower at the gym and coffee bought with coins found under the seat. And we made a plan that was not the plan of a rescuer and a rescued, but the plan of 2 citizens of a complicated world. And as I hung up, I felt the strangest sensation. Not relief exactly, not triumph. More a settling, as if the ground had acknowledged me, as if the life I had been building had nodded once and said, "Yes, you understand now. Love without vanishing, help without erasure, mercy without return to the door that closed." The day I chose the kind of woman I would be for the rest of my life began without ceremony, with a bus that sighed at each stop like an animal too old for show tricks, with my coat pockets heavy from the thermos, and the envelope I had addressed in my careful schoolteacher script to the man with the pavement-colored tie, with the small ache in my knees that never argues and never lies. And I rode to the legal aid clinic because it turns out a boundary sits up straighter when it has a stamp and a file number, and I signed my name beneath language that said I was of sound mind and under no coercion, and that any further inquiries about my whereabouts, my medical state, my bank accounts, or my best interests should go through the attorney listed below. And then I added a simple instruction to my bank profile, a phrase only Joyce and I could know, a password that tasted of lemon peel and smoke, and I walked out into a noon bright enough to show the dust on everything, and felt the strange relief of having moved my dignity from a feeling to a document. From there, I bought a loaf of bread, still warm, and 2 oranges. And then I crossed the municipal lot to where he had told me to meet him, a lot the color of old coins with oil, blossoms spreading like bruises after rain, and his car sat 3 spaces from the cart corral, windows fogged at the edges, the way breath fogs a confession. And he was in the driver's seat, pretending to read his phone, pretending he had not been, watching every person who crossed the lanes because he no longer trusted luck to bring what he wanted to his door. And when I tapped the glass, he started like a boy, caught with something breakable, then unlocked the door and did not get out. Because To stand there beside me would mean we were the same height, and he had built his comfort on the quiet slope of me being smaller. I opened the passenger door and placed the thermos in the cup holder and the paper sack on the seat where Liza's neat scorn used to ride, and I said his name softly, once the way a person says a password to a room that will hold only 2 people, and he said he was sorry in the way a man says it when he hopes the word will build a bridge over a river. He refuses to measure, and I listened long enough to be sure the apology was not a trick dressed as remorse. And then I told him what would happen next and what would not. You will eat. You will call this number at the shelter, because I spoke to a woman named Alma who does not make pity a performance, and she is expecting you before 5. You will speak with this counselor tomorrow because sleeping in a car is a bruise that looks like thrift, but is actually despair. And you will not come to my door, not tonight, and not any other night, because my home is a place where I do not vanish, and I will not invite absence in and call it love. He tried to argue the old way, with that careful accountant's logic he uses to turn cruelty into a line item and regret into a deductible. And he said it would only be for a week that I had a spare bed, that what was the point of family if not shelter? And I let him stack his blocks, and then I tipped the tower with one sentence that I had polished on the ride over until it shone like a blade. I will not trade my safety for your comfort again. He looked at me then in a way that suggested he was meeting me for the first time, not as the woman who sewed his Halloween costumes and translated his science homework into patience, but as a citizen who had paid her taxes in casseroles and rides and rent and was finally spending her own money on herself. And I reached into my coat pocket and took out an object so small it felt like a confession. The spare key he had given me to the house that carried my name only as a rumor, the one I used to keep on a ring with a little brass tag that read "back door." And I placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it and said, "This no longer opens anything of mine." And he startled, as if I had slapped him, though my hand had been gentler than it had any right to be. And for a second I saw the boy he had been when a fever broke, and he realized his body would not always betray him. The solemn gratitude that followed. And I knew that what I was doing had nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with refusing to teach him the wrong lesson again. He asked if I hated him, and I told him hate was too loud for the life I am building, that I felt something quieter and more exacting. I felt the insistence on truth, and the truth was that he had left me in a lounge chair 8 hours to keep his marriage unmarred by the shape of the woman who made it possible. And then later he had sent a man to measure my mind as if capacity were a room he had keys to. And now he wanted to be warmed by the house I heated with the money I made on my feet. And no, love that arrives as requisition does not find purchase here anymore. He did not cry. Men like him outsource their tears to the women they exhaust, but he sagged, and the car seemed to sag with him. And I stepped back because I have learned that proximity can look like consent, and I told him I would call at noon the next day, and if he wanted my help in the forms I have offered, he should answer. And if he did not answer, I would not call again, because mercy without boundary is a religion I have discarded. I walked away then, and the lot smelled of damp cardboard and exhaust, and the faint sweetness of oranges from a cart someone had abandoned in a hurry. And I realized my hands had stopped shaking, and that the ache in my jaw had dissolved, as if it had only been clenched against a story I had now finished telling. On the bus home, I opened the envelope for the lawyer one more time, not to second guess, but to admire the tidy geometry of a decision when it ceases to apologize. And I sealed it with a thumb dampened in my own mouth because I like the proof that my body participates in my safety. And I took it to the post office and watched the clerk stamp it with a sound like a small gavel on a soft table. And I sent a second envelope too. This one to Kieran, not with admonitions or a schedule for reunion, but with a poem I had copied in my looping old hand, and a note that said, "I trust your life to you," and a money order folded inside, not as a bribe to visit, but as acknowledgement that sometimes what a young man needs most is a grocery trip no one asks about. That evening, I burned the newspaper clipping in the sink, the way I had burned Adam's first letter. Not because fire makes history disappear, but because fire can turn lies into ash that rinses easily down a drain. And I opened the windows to let the smoke out and the night in, and Joyce stood beside me with a dish towel and said, "Well, what's done?" And I answered what needed doing, and we ate soup at the table. And later, Arthur stopped by on his slow walk home and handed me a tin of seeds for spring, parsley, chive, nasturtium, and said nothing about sons or cars or lawyers, only pointed at the packet and said these like bad soil if you break the surface first. And I thought how that, too, was a kind of blessing. When noon came the next day, I called, and he answered on the second ring, voice thready and normal. And he told me he had gone to the shelter, that Alma had made him fill out forms he did not want to fill, and had been nicer than he deserved, that he had showered and eaten eggs that tasted like nothing and everything, and I told him good, and we arranged not a rescue, not a return, but a sequence. And I hung up and felt the floor rise to meet my feet in a way it had not in years. After, I went to the bank and changed my beneficiaries, naming the library and Kieran and the cat shelter, because the order of my affections had finally learned to breathe without permission. And I bought a lockbox and a new lipstick, the color of dried cherries, and a lemon to slice into the water I'd drink at night. And when I returned to the efficiency, the radiator grumbled and the light in the kitchen hit the counter in a way that made the laminate look almost like marble. And I stood in my doorway and listened to the hum of a home that knows its owner by the sound of her keys, and I understood that the climax people expect, the slammed door, the shouted curses, the dramatic spectacle, was never mine. That my climax was administrative and domestic, and relentless, a string of small signatures and ordinary refusals that, taken together, formed a life where no one could mistake me for furniture again. And when the kettle whistled, I did not rush to quiet it. I let it sing a few seconds longer, because it was my kitchen and my whistle, and I wanted to hear the sound of something boiling for me. When he stepped into the little motel lobby and saw me waiting by the plastic fern, there was a pause in the world the way there is when someone remembers the right word after a long silence. And that pause held every awkwardness and every small mercy between us until we both decided which to keep. He looked older in the face, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper and kinder than the boy who once stole my lemon squares from the cooling rack, and we sat on the narrow bed with the cheap lamp between us like two people cupping the same small light, and spoke in the kind of sentences that do not try to fix each other, but only to be true. And in our truth there was no performance, no need for eyes to water dramatically for the record, only the steady exchange of facts and the soft admissions of things that had been left unspoken for too long. He told me, simply, that he had been sleeping in that little car and that it had not been the bravest thing he had ever done, but it had taught him the shape of shame and the taste of hunger. And I told him simply that I had left because staying had become a way of being diminished slowly until there was nothing left of the woman I knew, and neither of us spoke like we owned the other's right to grief, only our own. He handed me a small packet of scribbled lines where he had written down the name of a mechanic who took payments and a social worker who did not look at people like problems to be solved, but like neighbors who had drifted. And when I folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket, I felt an easing in my chest that was not the brittle relief of someone who has won an argument, but the deep, slow loosening of something knotted for years. We ate chips and a sandwich bought from the diner downstairs and traded quiet stories about birds and trains and the particular way the rain smells on hot pavement. And when he asked if I would come visit him in Portland, I looked at his shoes, the scuffs at the toes, and thought of the boy who used to build birdhouses with me, red paint everywhere and a proud grin. And I said yes, not because I needed to reclaim the past, but because I wanted to choose the parts of the future I would keep. And he smiled the timid, astonished smile you give when a person you have loved finally names you again without expecting anything in return. After he left for his train, he hugged me the way people hug when they are learning. Forgiveness is not always loud, and I went back to my small rented room and opened the drawer where I kept the poem Kieran had given me, folded inside a library card. And I read the lines aloud to myself because certain truths become truer when they are spoken. And one of them said that some women rise not from fire, but from the slow forgetting of other people's stories about them. And I understood then that my rising did not need fireworks or proclamations, only the repeated quiet acts of choosing myself. I wrote a letter in a careful hand to my son and his wife. It was short and unornamented and did not demand apologies. It only stated what had been decided with a firmness that felt like a hinge being set in a door. I will not return to a home that treats me as an inconvenience. I will not enter rooms where my presence must be negotiated. You may call Kieran and speak honestly if you wish, but the past cannot be traded back for comfort that comes at my expense. And I mailed that letter with a stamp that had a little bird on it because the bird was a witness and because small symbols keep memory honest. In the days that followed, I kept the routines that had sewn me back together. Mornings at the cafe, my apron tied just so. The tin of seeds Arthur left in my palm for the windowsill. The scratch of pencil in the crossword, until the last clue. Surrendered. And these ordinary threads built a life that felt less like recovery and more like a new room being furnished with things chosen by me rather than given as charity. I went to the potluck with Joyce and carried my lemon squares like a small flag, and when people asked where I came from, I answered simply that I had come from everywhere I had ever been, which was as true as anything I could say. And the woman who had once folded my name into silence at family dinners later waved from across the street and looked away, and that was her choice. I did not hate her for it because hatred is noisy and takes up room I no longer had to spare. Instead, I felt the subtler sensation of agreement. Agreement with myself that my life would be lived in ways that left room for both tenderness and boundary. I planted the parsley and the chives Arthur had given me and watched green edges appear where there had been only brown. And Kieran called on a Wednesday to tell me he had found a small job at the bookstore and that he'd shelved my favorite poet in a corner where the light hits just right. And when he said, almost in a whisper, "I'm glad you're okay," I answered, "So am I." Because the sentence was true and the truth had weight. The last thing I did, before I closed the drawer and slid the bird magnet into its little place on the fridge, and before I lit the candle Joyce had brought me for no reason but kindness, was write a note to myself in the notebook that had become my small ledger of rules. Remember your name, remember your edges. Do not return to a life that erases you. And I tucked that paper behind the recipes so that when I was old again and the world tried to shrink me by accident or choice, I could find this line and be reminded that I had not been taken from the table, but had, finally and by my own hand, chosen a different chair. And if anyone asks whether it was easier to leave or to stay, I will say neither and both, because courage is not always a single brave moment, but the sum of many tiny, resolute choices. And when I close my eyes at night now, the quiet that comes is not the hollow of abandonment, but the gentle fullness of a room I own.